Okay, so going into the service this morning, the Echoes of the Church Fathers is the series that we're going through. We're starting out with 1 Peter, and his kind of life is kind of this journey through discipleship. With Peter, we get to see more of his life than any other of the disciples. There is nobody else more talked to in the New Testament other than Jesus than Peter. It's Jesus, then it's Peter. Peter's talked about more than anybody else. And his life is kind of a template for us to follow. Somebody who has found Jesus and left everything behind to go follow him, but still struggles. In Peter's life, we get to see the highest highs and the lowest lows that you get to see from somebody. Nobody else proclaimed Jesus' name more, and also nobody was seen denying Christ like Jesus or like Peter did. We get to see these epic moments of Peter, and we also get to see these epic lows of Peter. So his life is kind of like a journey through discipleship. So we're going to be in 1 Peter chapter 2, and this service is called the People of God. So let's open up the scriptures together. 1 Peter chapter 2, we're going to read just the first 10 verses. Therefore, rid yourselves of all malice, all deceit, hypocrisy, envy, and slander of every kind. Like newborn babies, crave pure spiritual milk, so that by you may grow up in your salvation, now that you have tasted that the Lord is good. So kind of reading this to myself, I kind of had a little bit of an issue of how he wrote this. I think it's a little bit like kind of maybe stated backwards. Kind of when I was reading it and I was kind of like meditating on it, I think I kind of wanted to rephrase it a little bit. Because when it talks about in verse 3, now that you've tasted that the Lord is good, I feel like that's a great place to start. So if we pull verse 3 and we put it upon everything else, it kind of makes some sense. Now that you've tasted that the Lord is good, you should rid yourselves of all malice, all deceit, hypocrisy, envy, and slander of every kind. And like newborn babies, you should crave pure spiritual milk, so that by it you may grow up in your salvation. Kind of something that this is kind of tying in from last week. Last week we talked about being holy. This was Peter's kind of mantra. Be holy as the Lord is holy. This is what holiness looks like. It's ridding yourselves of malice and deceit and hypocrisy, envy, slander of every kind. And the way that we live out holiness, kind of like this image that he gives us, is like newborn babies that crave this spiritual milk. Has anybody had babies in this room? Anybody had like a little child? They are extremely fussy when they don't get fed. There's this craving. My son Emmy is just so, he screams, and it hurts my head how hard he screams. But it's just like there's this something inside of him that just screams, and it gets so angry when he's not being fed. And this is that kind of imagery that Peter wants us to have when talking about the Spirit. There's this desperate sense of almost like, I am going to die if I do not get this milk. And that's what holiness looks like for us, this craving of the Spirit. And like what I started out with this kind of like being maybe phrased backwards. Peter's totally right. He wrote it the way he did. But the way that it makes sense to me is, once we have tasted of the Lord, once we have seen his goodness, and it's not saying once you have tasted the Lord and you're like, oh, I guess I decide it's good. It's not this like chance like, oh, I tasted God and you know what? He was kind of bland, I don't know if I really like that. When you have tasted God, you experience his goodness. And there's this concept in walk of life called Calvinism. It's called this irresistible grace. It's that this Christian is literally unable to deny Christ when he has experienced him. It's called irresistible grace. I don't know if I fully buy into it, but I love the imagery of once you have tasted God, you're unable to walk away. And for me, when I think about it for myself, I cannot imagine any other kind of walk of life for myself. because I have tasted and I have found that the Lord is good. And in him there is no darkness. And these are some of these concepts that we're going to be walking through later. In Psalm 42:1, the psalmist says this, "As the deer pants for streams of water, so my soul pants for you." And it's this imagery of I'm going to leave all of these other things behind because I found something better. For the Christian, there's no more need for malice. There's no more need for deceit. There's no more need to be a hypocrite. There's no more need to envy other people or to say any kind of slander. There's no more need because I've found something better, and I've found pure spiritual milk. And kind of taking on the imagery of a baby, you're fully reliant upon the parent to be fed. And that's exactly what we want to be as children. Fully reliant upon the Father. And once we have tasted him, there's this sense of no more going back. Continue on in verse 4. As you come to him, this living stone rejected by humans but chosen by God, precious to him, you also, like living stones, are being built into a spiritual house to be a holy priesthood, offering up spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. For in scriptures it says, See, I lay a stone in Zion, a chosen and precious cornerstone, and the one who trusts in him will never be put to shame. This may be another passage where we maybe need to rephrase to get our head straight with this. As Peter is writing this, he's adding details to forward the point, but he needs some unraveling in order to kind of grasp it for this. As you come to know him, so let's go back. As you come to know him, you are offering up spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. The him we are talking about, this living stone that was rejected by humanity, was also chosen by God. And in the same way, you too are living stones that are being built into a spiritual house to be a holy priesthood. We are living stones because we have been raised to life by the living stone, Jesus Christ himself. So as you come to know him, this living stone, you also, like living stones, are being built into a spiritual house, this holy priesthood. And this living stone, Jesus Christ himself, was rejected by humans, but he was chosen by God, and he is precious to him. What we are seeing is that when we as Christians, we as the church, our goal is not just to exist. For once we were dead stones. But now we are made alive by Christ. And what we see with our lives, what we're supposed to be doing, is we are being built into a spiritual house to be a holy priesthood. What Peter is actually doing is really subtle here. He's actually talking about the church being substituted for the temple that was existing in their day. What we see with the temple is that it was a building that was built by human hands and it was dead. The temple that we're talking about here is actually the third temple that was built for the Lord. The first one was the most immaculate. It was built by King Solomon, who built this place, and it was the first worship place that the Lord ever existed where it stayed in one place. God said, I want you to build for me a tabernacle that would move around wherever I would go. But the people of God said, we want to give you a place that is firm, that's going to stay forever. So he said, okay. So he allowed them to build a temple, and they put so much money into this. They said that every single huge brick of stone was inlaid with gold. And instead of using mortar, they actually used gold to fit each stone together. This building was immaculate. And it's actually stated that Solomon was the most wealthy king that has ever existed. Just an absolute obscene amount of money was put into this temple. But when the people faded away from the Lord, when they walked away from the Lord, the temple was destroyed once again, or for the very first time. And when the people were able to come back into the place and when they were able to come back into Israel, the first thing they did was rebuilt the temple. So this was the second temple. And this was kind of this retry, this reboot, trying to get back to this place where they worship God. But again, the people's hearts started to walk away from the Lord. And so this man named Herod decided he wanted to build an even greater temple than Solomon did. He didn't have as much money, but he built the temple bigger than it was. It wasn't more immaculate, but it was bigger. But what happened is this temple became a worship place for people. God had been silent for over 400 years. Before, when you'd walk into the temple, there was this sense that you would feel that the Spirit of the Lord was there. But for 400 years, it was silent. The temple was dead. Until Jesus Christ himself came to establish the new temple himself. So when Jesus came, he took on this imagery of I am the temple. And so when Peter, one of his disciples, is talking to us this morning, what he's telling the church is you are the substitution for the temple. This temple that we go to worship as Jews is dead and it's gone. So there is this new temple that is alive. So when he calls us living stones, we as the church are building this place where we commune with God. And he calls us this holy priesthood. The priests were the ones who would go in and they were the servants of God. They were the mediators between God and his people. And that's what Peter is calling us to do as all Christians. Because the first priests, you had to be a Levite in order to be a priest. It was very select and there's very few priests. But Peter is opening up to all Christians are priests. All people are servants of the Lord. And I actually absolutely love this last phrase that he talks about. Those who trust in the Lord will never be put to shame, for it is their cornerstone. In Isaiah chapter 28:16, this is what Peter's referencing. See, I lay a stone in Zion, a tested stone, a precious cornerstone for a sure foundation. The one who relies on it will never be put to panic. They will never be stricken with panic. Isaiah was preaching a message of judgment with a contrast between the one who relies upon the Lord and the one who does not. The one who relies upon the Lord will never be stricken with panic. They will never be put to shame, like Peter says. While the one who does not rely upon the Lord will be full of panic, and they will be put to shame. And verse 6 that we look at actually kind of has this dual meaning. Number one, shame was something that no one wanted to fall into. And the Christian belief is filled with supposed contradictions and mystery. For the Romans that looked at the Christians, they mocked them and they viewed them with shame. The way of life was really strange. And for the Jewish people, they looked at Christians as this kind of religious zealot sect that walked away from them. They looked at Christianity as a cult. So if you walked to someone and you said that you were a Christian to a Jew, they hated you. And for a lot of these people, these are Gentiles, non-Jewish people coming up and saying, yeah, we believe in the same God and we have the same beliefs. It was ridiculous. They looked at them as if they were stupid. But what Peter's trying to say is this precious stone that he's already established as Jesus, this cornerstone, the one who puts their trust in him, will not be put to shame. And the second meaning is this. This is God's chosen stone. This is God's chosen person to lead the entire world. If you don't trust in him, you are automatically put to shame because of how ridiculous it is. God himself, the creator of the universe, said this is the foundation to your life. If you don't believe this, you're already in shame. Because you look stupid. You're not putting your life on something that's firm. So what exactly is a cornerstone? It's this part of the foundation that's the strongest part. When you look at a building, the place that has the most weight and most pressure is the corner. Your building will fall down and fail if your corners aren't strong. Doesn't matter if your sides are strong. If that corner is not firm, everything will fall through. So this imagery of the cornerstone is that Jesus Christ himself is the firmest part of our foundation. This corner, this foundation, this rugged foundation. And if you don't put your trust in the corner, if you don't have a firm corner, you're going to fall through and you look shameful. When you look at the Tower of Pisa, what you see is a building with not firm corners. Their foundation was not strong, and they built this bell tower to be immaculate. They built it so big and so strong and so powerful, but the foundation wasn't firm. And the building began to sink, began to lean. And this costs millions upon millions of dollars to build. And now they're kind of a joke. When you talk about a dumb building, you talk about the Tower of Pisa. It's so unsafe that you can't even walk in there anymore. Because it's still leaning. It's still leaning more every single year. If you don't have a firm foundation, you're put to shame. So this is what Peter's calling us to do. And he's trying to convince these early Christians, don't worry about the world. We have a strong cornerstone. We have a strong foundation. Moving on in verse 7. Now to you who believe, this stone is precious. But to those who do not believe, the stone the builders rejected has become their cornerstone. In verse 8, a stone that causes people to stumble and a rock that makes them fall. They stumble because they disobey the message, which is also what they are destined for. So kind of taking that first verse back. Peter is actually relating to Psalm chapter 118, verse 22. The stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. The Lord has done this, and it is marvelous in our eyes. The Lord has done it this very day. Let us rejoice today and be glad. Jesus uses this phrase in Matthew, Mark, and Luke to speak against the Pharisees and the Jewish nation who has rejected their God. Jesus Christ, who is God in flesh, says that you have rejected me. You've rejected the message. But the stone that you have rejected, the man that you've rejected, has now become the most important part of the foundation. So this is Jesus talking to the Jewish nation, the people that are supposed to be worshiping God. He's like, you act like you love God, but yet you're rejecting the thing that he has made the foundation of your life. How can you worship God but then reject him in the same light? That's what Peter's talking about. That's what Jesus was talking about. But what Peter is doing this is he's expanding it past the Jewish nation, and he's talking to the world at large. The world has rejected God. They've rejected the stone, but that stone has now become their cornerstone. They've rejected the thing that holds their very existence in life. For the one who believes, verse 7, if you believe in Christ, you believe that this stone is precious. But if you don't believe in it, guess what? It's the most important of your life. And this is the kind of stone that makes people stumble. And it's a rock that makes them fall. This stone is not only your foundation, but it will destroy every part of your life if you reject it. Peter then drops a bomb at the end of this section. And this actually leads into a greater conversation. So the reason that people stumble when they come to Christ is because they disobey this message, which they were also destined for. Can we be held responsible for what the Lord has destined for us? The answer is yes. Even though God has destined all things to happen, we are still accountable for ourselves for what we do. But how can this be? How can we reconcile this fact? And this is one of the greatest conversations in Christianity because we really don't know. I'm coming up here as a pastor who's reading the scriptures, and I've read so many commentaries on this. There's no clear answer. How does God control everything, yet we are also responsible for what we do? So something that I was kind of trying to wrap my brain around to kind of reconcile is this. What does it say about God if he is not in control of all things? The God who created everything, if he's not in control of all things, what does that say about him? For who he is as God, for him being God, for the very value of him being God, everything has to be controlled by him because he's God. By the nature of him being God, everything has to be under his control. Because what we would find if God is not, is that the whims of man, the decisions that we can do, can fight against what God is trying to do. And if God is not ultimately in control, how strong is he really? So what we look at as Christians is we say, okay, you know what? God is in control of everything. But if we look in that verse 8, we stumble because we disobey. So there's this both and. God is in control of all things. But how we respond to that is on us. So when I talk about this kind of concept of talking about free will versus God's complete sovereignty, is we don't understand what's actually going on. Also, we don't know the end of the story. So for some people, they like to take themselves out of this conversation and say, if I sin, it's really God doing it because it's not me. God determined all things. Except the conscience of your heart knows that you make the decisions that you make. So for you, you have to make the question for yourself. You have to answer these questions. When I taste the Lord, do I find him to be good? When I experience who he is, what do I believe about him? Because when we see God causing all things, both good and evil are caused by God. Yet God is not doing the evil, but he's causing it because it comes from inside of himself to control all things. And there's this weird imagery, there's this weird thing to think about when we talk about, can God be evil? And the answer is no. By virtue of him being God, he is good. Because when we talk about good and evil, the difference between the two is that good is how things should be. And evil is just broken good. There's nothing original to evil. If you look at every single sinful and evil act that a person can do, it's really just a broken version of what good is. And God is what everything should be because he's God. He created it in a way that was perfect. So when we look at evil, it's just broken good. God cannot be a broken version of himself, so God is always good. And it's this really mind-hurting kind of conversation, and I really struggle with it. And that's a part of the good thing, is what's my decision when I come to see the Father? The question is always flipped back to the individual. What's your decision on God? When you look at him, verse 7, when you look at Jesus, do you see him as precious? Or do you walk away from him? All these other conversations about him being strong and him being good, this is a different conversation. Continue on in verse 9. But you are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's special possession, that you may declare the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his wonderful light. Once you were not a people, but now you are the people of God. Once you had not received mercy, but now you've received mercy. And this is where we get to see that full redeeming power of God being in control. When God looks at us, his people, he calls us chosen. He calls us to be his people, a royal priesthood. He calls us a holy nation, and he calls us his own special possession. When Peter is bringing up this really complicated understanding of God being in control of all things, but us being responsible for our own actions, he's actually doing this to encourage us. So when we, the people of God, undergo some of these hard things in life, what Peter's trying to get us to understand is that God's in control of all things. So take heart in knowing that if God is causing evil, him being good means that there's a good result in the end for us. This is for us to be comforted by the fact that God is in control. Nothing that happens in the world happens outside of his sight. And this is where we really get to see the redeeming quality of this. Because God, if God is predestining people to evil, he's also predestining people to good. Choosing us, calling us his people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, and his own special possession. And these are some of the high things that are beyond our comprehension, but these should comfort us this morning. Because God is acting on our behalf. Once you were nobody. You were not a people. But now you're the people of God. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have. It's this feeling of being chosen. Has anybody played a pickup game where people pick teams? There's this rush that you feel when you get chosen. Who's married in this room or has been married or has a girlfriend or something? There's this feeling that you experience when you feel chosen by somebody. When you get looked at and they see you for you, there's this thing that's inside of you that just bursts with energy when you feel chosen. And on a greater scale, this is how God views us. This feeling of chosen, this reaching down and saying, I pick you. For each of us that looks at God and says, I view you as precious. I view you as the most important part of my life. God says, I chose you. You were chosen to believe those things. You are chosen. There's that great feeling that we get to experience. He also calls us the royal priesthood. We are spiritual servants of the King. That royal part, looking at who we are serving. We are serving the King. And as priests, being this priesthood, we are his servants. We get to wait on the hands and feet of Jesus Christ himself. For the one who views God as precious, this is the most exciting part. We get to serve him. We get to do things for him. Being a holy nation, a nation meaning a people group coming together to kind of form this new cohesive identity. Once we were separated out from each other, but now we are groped in and being called a holy nation. A people group gathered together who are perfect. Lastly, he calls us his special possession. Does anybody have a wedding ring in here? Does anybody have any pieces of jewelry? Does anybody have something that you're really passionate about? There's something different about that than everything else. There are some material things in our life that we look at differently than everything else. If you had to save something from a fire, there's certain things that you make sure you do not leave without. Other things you're like, let it burn, that's fine. I'll buy something new. Most of our clothes, we say, yeah, that's fine. Insurance company will give me money and I'm able to buy some more stuff, right? Some of those things are replaceable, but there's some things that are not. When God looks at you, you're not replaceable to him. And the world that is going to burn He says, I'm saving you. I'm making sure I'm not leaving that place unless I get you out of it. Why are we supposed to do this? Because we are his people now. And as his people, our duty is to declare the praises of him who called us out of darkness into his wonderful light. Our purpose as his people is to declare his praises. To declare the praises of the man who came to drag us out of darkness and into his light. One of the biggest concepts in 1 Peter is that God is light. If you look at the New Testament, it says God is light and the world is darkness. And you're either in light or you're in darkness, and that's really how it is. When you look at the battle between light and darkness, what happens to a dark room when you turn a light on? It's lit up. Darkness doesn't put up a fight against light. Darkness has no power against light because the essence of what darkness is just an absence of light. Darkness isn't this mystical power that's out there in the world. It's just absent of God. When we look at the darkness and the horrible deeds that people do, what we really see is people that just don't have God. It's people that don't have that light. So our purpose as people is just to declare his praises. And again, Peter is saying all these things to comfort these Christians. You are chosen. You are his people. You are his special possession. All you have to do is what you would normally do for things you're excited about. Just talk about it. I'm a Vikings fan. I get excited when they do good things. I talk about it because I'm excited about it. My only purpose as a Vikings fan is literally just to talk about it. That's all the Vikings want me to do is just talk about them, right? As a fan, you just want to be popular and be talked about. That's what the media is. They just want you to talk about the things. They want you to be invested. They want you to be excited about it. That's how it is with God. And all of this comes back to the very first verse. Verse 3, when I get back there. Now that you have tasted that the Lord is good. So kind of wrapping a bow on all of this. Now that you have tasted that the Lord is good, declare the praises of him who called you out of darkness and into the light. Just putting a big bow on all this in the service this morning. For some of us, there's some struggles that we have when we talk about God. There's some things we don't understand. And that's totally fine. That's how it's supposed to be. We are not God. There's things that are beyond us that God knows that we don't know. That's not for us to touch. What we have to decide is the Lord good? When I look at the Lord, do I find him to be precious? Because when you look at the other hand, he looks at you and says, you are my most special possession. God is working for the good of those who trust him. And he gives you something to praise about. He gives you something to be excited about. Being a Christian is just living how you should. He's given you everything. He is everything to you. Your natural expression is just to be like him and to be thankful. And just talk about him. So with that, let's end the service this morning. Jesus, we are just so thankful for who you are. We're thankful for this message. We're thankful that you speak to us. And God, we just thank you that you choose us, that you view us as valuable and special. And God, we don't want to reject you because we know that you are the foundation of our life. We just want to just take part in it just by praising you, speaking out your praises. That's all you want us to do, God. I pray that we would do that as your people. In your name we pray. Amen. Before you leave, all right, if you have to leave, that's fine. But if you don't have to leave right away, I just encourage you to take somebody by the side and just talk to them, pray with them. Go through some of these spiritual disciplines. Maybe talk about what you've read in Scripture this week. Maybe there's some things you need prayer for. Maybe you need the Spirit of God to do something. This is the interactive part of the service. And honestly, if you ask me, this is the most important part. Paying attention, that's fine. Worshiping together, that's fine. But your connection to each other, that's what church really is. Church is interactive. And after service, that's what I want for a church, to interact with one another, engage with one another. So if you have some time, I encourage you to do that. If you need to leave, that's fine too. Thank you so much for coming to Amazing Grace Church. Please have a good day.